Hello, friends. We are in American Revolution, Road to Independence. This is Chapter 2, Part 2. Before we start, let's do a little bit of review. We know that the colonists were unhappy about the taxes, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. And they had been peaceful in saying they were unhappy and in their protests. But then a fight broke out. And that fighting in Boston became known as
the Boston Massacre.
The Boston Massacre. Please find page 14 in your reader. And today we're going to read about the world's largest tea party. I'm going to give you a hint. It wasn't really a tea party like we would think. We're little cups of tea and fancy dresses and little tiny sandwiches and cookies.
It's in the name, though.
But it's in the name. Here we go. In December 1773, there was another incident in Boston. 3 ships loaded with tea were docked in the Boston harbor. The captains had orders to unload the tea so it could be sold in Boston. And friends, remember, there was a tax on imports, including tea. So if the Bostonians were to drink the tea from Britain, they were saying, we'll pay the tax. If they didn't drink the tea, they were saying, no, I won't, because we don't want taxation without representation. So these ships showed up and they were told to unload the tea in Boston Harbor to be sold in Boston. Paragraph 2. The Sons of Liberty refused to let this happen. They had spent a lot of time convincing the people of Boston not to buy and sell British tea. There was no way they were going to let the captains unload all of that tea. The Sons of Liberty demanded the captains raise their anchor and sail away. How do you think the captains felt about that?
Well, they said, we have orders from the king.
Okay, so they had been ordered to unload the tea, but now someone else is telling them to go away. Third paragraph. The captains weren't sure what to do, so they did not do anything. The ships sat in the harbor until the Sons of Liberty finally decided to get rid of the tea once and for all. Dressed as Native Americans, they and other members of the Patriot movement boarded the ships and threw the tea into the Boston harbor. They dumped approximately 340 chests of tea, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, into the Atlantic Ocean. Later, this act of protest came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. So, why do you think the incident in Boston Harbor became known as the Boston Tea Party?
It is a metaphorical term. Tea is drunk at a tea party. No tea was drunk, yet there was certainly enough tea in the ocean for the world's largest tea party.
They basically turned the ocean in the harbor into a big pot of tea. So why did the Sons of Liberty dump the chest of tea into the harbor?
They had spent a lot of time and effort convincing the people of Boston not to buy or sell British tea, and they were not going to let the captains unload all that tea. When the captains did nothing, the Sons of Liberty decided to get rid of the tea, so they dumped it into the Boston harbor.
If the captains weren't going to do something and go away with the tea, they were going to dump the tea. So your page 13 has an image of the Patriots dumping the tea. Okay, and you can see their heads. They have some Native American headdresses on. They just disguise themselves as Native Americans. Page 16. We're going to read about a woman named Phyllis Wheatley.
When the Stamp Act was repealed, so many people in the colonies were delighted. Some people wrote articles, letters, and songs expressing their gratitude. One woman, named Phyllis Wheatley, wrote a poem. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved African who had been brought to Massachusetts on a slave ship. She had gone to work in the home of a merchant named John Wheatley. The Wheatleys taught her to read and write. Eventually, she began to write poetry. A book of her poems was published in 1773. Her poem to King George became one of her best-known works.
To the King's Most Excellent Majesty, 1768. This is her poem. Your subjects' hope, dread sire. The crown upon your brows may flourish long, and that your arm may in God be strong. O may your scepter numerous nations sway, and all with love and readiness obey. But how shall we the British King reward? Rule thou in peace, our Father and our Lord. Midst the remembrance of thy favors past, the meanest peasants must most admire the last. May George, beloved by all the nations around, give the heavens' choicest constant blessings crowned. Great God direct and guide him from on high, and from his hand let every evil fly. And may each clime with equal gladness see a monarch's smile can set his subjects free. And friends, there's a little asterisk down at the bottom, down here, and it goes with this little asterisk right here. They're talking about the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay, so that's a lot. Let's think about this. Who was Phyllis Wheatley?
She was an enslaved African who lived in Massachusetts and wrote a poem when the Stamp Act was repealed.
Okay, so we read her poem. Doesn't really sound like the language that we would use. It has a lot of old language and it's a lot of symbolic language. But do you think Wheatley's poem is favorable or unfavorable to the king?
The poem is favorable, praising the king. Evident?
Okay, and how do we know that? May the crown may flourish long. All with love and readiness obey.
Our Father and our Lord, George, be loved by all the nations.
Or we can look at the first lines of the poem where the author mentions the colonists' numerous expressions of gratitude for the king's repeal of the Stamp Act, such as in letters, articles,
and songs.
Yeah. Okay. So the poem uses a reference to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay, and that is those two lines in the poem near the asterisk. That's what she's talking about the repeal of the Stamp Act. Midst the remembrance of thy favors past. The favor is the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay, let's go to page 17 and read about another famous person from the American Revolution. Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks was among the people killed during the Boston Massacre. Attucks was part African and part Native American. He had been enslaved, but at the time of the Boston Massacre, he was a sailor. During the crossfire, Attucks was shot in the chest and died immediately. 3 others, and eventually a fourth, also died as a result of the incident in Boston. On the day of the funerals, many shops closed. Thousands of people filed through the streets of Boston, following the victims' coffins. Attucks and the others became heroes.
Okay, even though they were killed, they became heroes. So, why is Crispus Attucks remembered today?
He was one of the people who died during the Boston Massacre.
Okay, all right. Now I'm going to read about Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was largely made up of small business owners. Several were merchants and tradesmen. The group got its name from an Irish man named Isaac Barr. Barr was a soldier and a politician. He spoke out in the British Parliament against some of the decisions being made regarding the colonies. Like George Washington, Isaac Barr fought in the French and Indian War. He was involved in the defeat of the French at the Battle of Quebec. He was strongly opposed to the taxes that were being imposed on the colonists. In one of his speeches, Barr referred to the colonists as Sons of Liberty. The name inspired some of the protesters in the colonies. and the group has been known as the Sons of Liberty ever since. So why did Isaac Barr refer to the colonists as the Sons of Liberty?
He was strongly opposed to the taxes the British imposed on the colonists. He supported the colonists in their decision to fight for freedom. He thought they would fight for freedom in the same manner they would fight for a family member.
Okay, that's the end of chapter 2, but before we leave, we need to answer our big question. So, what was the big question that we started with at the beginning of this chapter?
Who were the Sons of Liberty, and what form of protest did they lead in the Boston Harbor?
Okay, so I think the Sons of Liberty was a group of protesters who formed in Boston in response to the Stamp Act. They gave speeches against taxes and the British government. When Parliament replaced the Stamp Act with a tax on tea, the Sons of Liberty led a protest by dumping chests of tea into the harbor. Now, one more thing. The title of this chapter is Trouble is Brewing, which means trouble is developing. What was the trouble?
The title of this chapter is The Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, so the trouble that was brewing was the Boston Tea Party. Thanks, friends. See you next time.